there we go. Can you hear me in the back? Somebody raise their hands. Do you want to hear me in the back? All the hands went down. That makes sense. Well, you know, it's a pleasure to be here today, and this is a nice facility. You know, we were talking earlier today how Fargo has grown over the last 20 years, and a lot of great places have been built. You know, and I always keep a list of where I presented over the years. Watertown. How many people have been down in Watertown, South Dakota? Just about everybody, right? I was presenting at the Winter Show about 6-7 years ago, and they had me down in the cattle ring. It was really kind of fun. They had the Charolais ahead of me, and they had the Angus coming in behind me. And so they literally set up the projector just like this, they put up a screen, and then these guys put down all these wood shavings. I said, well, thanks guys, I really appreciate the wood shavings. They said, oh, no problem, you know what economists leave behind. You know, so I know enough not to take myself too serious, you know, and economists kind of do get a reputation of being know-it-alls, you know, and I was down in western Minnesota, where our family's originally from, last summer. I was giving a talk at the Quonset hut, of all places, and there was a nice older lady in the front row, and I noticed she got more and more upset as I spoke. And finally she couldn't stop herself. She says, aren't you a know-it-all son of a bitch? I said, Mom, that's not fair. So, you know, you'll understand her sentiments a little bit later. But, you know, it's a pleasure to be here today. I want to talk about something a little bit differently. I'm not here today to forecast. You know, when you forecast, you're always wrong. And I always joke that the only difference between my forecast and your forecasts are, I'm professionally wrong, right? You're amateurishly wrong. We're both wrong together. But I want to do something a little bit different today. You know, one of the points I've been making recently is agribusinesses, such as yourselves, and you are agribusinesses, are big business. You might not think that because it's hard to get a reference point. And I was just visiting a little bit earlier today. If you look at full-service restaurants, you know, we have a database of credit that we work with. And there's like 5,000 full-service restaurants we have in that database. 85% of those full-service restaurants have less than $1 million worth of assets. And then when I went and looked at the farming operations in that same database, you know, 85% of the farming operations in today's world have $5 million or more in assets. Well, think about that. What's the new joke down in Iowa? What does it take to be a millionaire? And what's the answer? 80 acres, right? Well, you know, chuckle, right? Huh? Well, it's not that far off up here in North Dakota when you start thinking about some of the land prices that we're seeing. So, one of the things I do today is I come out and I talk to producers like yourself and say, look, you are big agribusinesses. Not relative to Cargill, not relative to, say, you know, ADM, but you're big businesses relative to Main Street businesses in this country. Most businesses don't have the asset base that you're working with. And when you think about it, you have to step up your game. I mean, when you're managing those type of assets, the return is important, strategy is important. So I'm here today to talk to you like real business people that you are about the economic outlook and some of the impacts that I think you should be taking into consideration. This is not a, I'm going to guess the future price of corn and be wrong type talk. You know, if I can do that, I'd be wrong. I just know I'd be wrong. There's a couple of reasons. Let's start with this slide. This is a slide that I always start with because it's more of a philosophical statement about what you can and can't do in a business analysis. Everything's connected, we just don't see how. When you think about things philosophically, we have a system. A system is when things interact with each other. When you have a system with at least one feedback loop, things become inherently unpredictable. Now, not being able to predict something is like this. I can't give you the right date and the right price. But that's different than anticipation. You can anticipate. In a system, patterns get developed, and you can anticipate patterns. Now think about anticipation this way. Who enjoys professional football? Anybody enjoy professional football? Wow, you true North Dakota people, you wouldn't raise your hand for anything, would you? But think about professional football. I'm a big professional football fan. Think about great quarterbacks like Peyton Manning and Tom Brady. Anticipation. When they get blitzed, what do? They throw a short pass or they throw the ball away, right? Now what do Vikings quarterbacks do? Yeah, they take a 15-yard sack, right? You know, and somebody was upset, you know, when I was talking about the Vikings that way a couple days ago. I said, it's interesting. 2 weeks ago I was in Green Bay. I'm sitting in the bar, and the guy next to me is a Packers fan, of course, talking to me about Aaron Rodgers this and Aaron Rodgers that. I finally said, look, I don't care about professional football. I'm a Vikings fan, right? It's easy to pick on them. But think about anticipation that way. They don't forecast every play. But what they do is they know what to do with contingencies. Great quarterbacks don't take 15 and 20-yard sacks very often. They usually have a way of dealing with the problem that makes the best out of a bad situation. Too many people want to have a forecast that they're going to stick to no matter whether they're seeing a blitz coming at them or not. Anticipation is about looking at patterns and dealing with contingencies. Now, talk about patterns and loops. I said that philosophically and mathematically, if you have a single loop in a system where things interact, systems become inherently chaotic. Here's a very simplified representation of the corn market that we're dealing with today. First and most importantly, corn looks at ethanol. Ethanol looks at corn. If you look at the weekly Iowa market for corn and ethanol, they are so strongly related that it is very, very disturbing. Almost every price signal into the corn market is coming from the energy side. Then you got global corn that looks at U.S. corn or global grain looking at U.S. grain, and they interact with each other. Our crop's going up, they have adjustments. Their crop's changing, we have adjustments. And then you have livestock looking at feed from the corn side. Three very dynamic loops, three strong loops that are going to make it inherently unpredictable. And this is just scratching the surface of all the interactions that are going on in the corn market. Now, there's a corollary. When you have a system like this, nothing moves in a straight line. You go back and look. Every single story that you get told from the marketing side is a straightforward story. This is going to happen because X and Y are happening. And then almost inevitably, something comes along and blindsides that approach. So, in a systems approach, predictability is not there. But patterns are, and you can anticipate. Now, let's talk about risk versus uncertainty. You're the CFO and the CEO of your agribusiness. You need to understand risk management. Now, I don't think risk is the biggest part of your problem. It's interesting. I was down in Tama, Iowa about a couple months ago, and they were holding their meeting at a casino. Now, Ola is smart enough not to bring these guys to the casino. But I said, look at the casino. The casino is risk. What's the difference between risk and uncertainty? Risk is something that you can quantify. When you roll dice, when you play cards, you know exactly what the odds are of certain things happening. It's extremely quantifiable. But that's not the problem with uncertainty. A lot of times we say, there's a lot of risk in farming. That's the problem that farmers have. There's a lot of risk. Well, there's a challenge. But you have a lot of risk management tools to deal with risk. Now, you have crop insurance, federal, subsidized federal crop insurance. You have futures, you have options, you have forward contracting. There are a lot of things that you can do to mitigate risk. Now, risk is something that you can talk about where you can quantify it. How often do you get X degree days? How often do you get this much rain or lack of rain? You look back over a period of time with weather events, you quantify that. Now, huge question is whether the history is going to help you predict the future. In many cases, it's a pretty strong relationship. Risk can be mitigated. The problem that a lot of people have is mitigating risk also costs money, and they don't like that part of the equation. I think the biggest problem that we have is uncertainty. Ethanol policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and global trade policy. What is the common thread between everything up there? Policy. Policy comes from the Greek word poly, political. P-O-L-I. Poly is Greek for people. People are the true source of risk and uncertainty in this world because they can change their minds overnight, instantaneously. You can have policy blow up on you faster than you can deal with it. And how do you mitigate policy risk? Because you don't even know what it's quantified as. So the key drivers in the world today for us to work with, for us as business people to mitigate, is policy risk. So what are we doing about policy risk? Now, let's talk about the economy. I'm going to talk about the general economy and how this relates to your managing your business opportunities. You know, I always say the facts are just like the busboy at Hooters. You know why? Because nobody looks at him either, right? Now, my wife approved that joke, so I can tell her. But the problem that we have, a lot of times we talk about the economy, but we don't really want to spend any time digging into some of the facts. So let's spend a little time doing that. Talk about GDP performance. We're going to talk about how fast are we growing, and is it going to increase or decrease, and what's driving that performance. We're going to talk about employment and earnings, because a lot of times when you say, what is corn worth? You have to say, what is meat worth, what is dairy worth, and what is ethanol worth to the consumer, and why are they willing to pay for it? And that's about employment and earnings. Business investment, another key element. Very, very poor performance in business investment, and the question is why? And last, and probably almost as important as everything else, government fiscal performance. So here are 4 elements of the economy that I think we should take a moment to discuss because they're very important to us as business operators. Now, we'll make these slides available. But this slide is something that you should sit and think about for a while when you get a chance. These numbers come from the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office is known by its acronym in Washington, D.C. as the CBO. A lot of times if you're listening to, CNBC or whatever newscast for business, they'll say the CBO says. The CBO they're referring to is this Congressional Budget Office. Now, the Congressional Budget Office is supposed to be a nonpartisan part of the government that's supposed to look at the economic impact of proposed legislation. Now, the Congressional Budget Office did a service for us. They went back and looked at economic growth over the last 50 plus years, and then they have a forecast. What's interesting on this chart is it looks at a couple of things at the same time. The height of the bar is the average GDP growth during a period of time. GDP, another acronym we hear a lot, stands for Gross Domestic Product. And gross domestic product is supposed to be the value of all the goods and services that are produced and purchased over the course of a year. So the height of the bar in this chart is looking at economic growth during different periods of time. And then within the height of the bar, the Congressional Budget Office said, well, where did the growth come from? More equipment, more factories, more hours and more jobs, and more productivity. They assigned how much of the growth came from which of those 3 elements: jobs, capital, and productivity. Now, what's interesting is they kind of broke these eras into different political eras and economic eras. 1950 to 1973 was pre-oil embargo. 1974 to 81 was rising inflationary environment. 1982 was the Paul Volcker shock therapy, and then the declining inflationary environment to 1990. 1991 was another recession, and then the tech stock bubble, and then September 2001 was, of course, 9/11. I don't know what we're going to call the last decade, but when you look at the pattern, there's something very clear that emerges. First off, our growth rate has declined very noticeably over the last decade compared to the previous 40, 50 years. And the contribution from hours worked has declined pretty remarkably as well. So the question is, why is that happening? And then look at their forecast going forward. They're only forecasting 2.5% real gross domestic product growth over the next decade. And even that is a questionable assumption. So we have to understand what we're seeing to make a judgment on a business investment from our side. Now, what we're seeing here relates to the last slide. There's 2 fictitious numbers up on this slide. The black line is the real GDP growth in this economy. I call it a fictitious number because you realistically can't expect a single number to capture all that information in one number. Now the red line is even more mythical. It's a number known as potential GDP. Now, why would we care about that red line? Because it's very important to two things that are going to drive your business opportunities: fiscal policy and monetary policy. The red line comes from the Congressional Budget Office. Again, it is a calculation. It says if we have 5.5% unemployment and we run our factories at normal capacity, this would be how much goods and services we would produce in this country. Now look what happened back in 2008, 2009. We had that sharp recession. GDP dropped, and then when the recovery started, it ran parallel to that red line. It never caught back up. Why is that important to us in this room? There's two reasons from the policy side. First, monetary policy. Monetary policy is interest rates. People in this room who buy things like land are looking at what interest rate is there for me to buy that ground with. What can I borrow money at? The Federal Reserve, as we know, has kept interest rates at ultra low levels over the last 4 years and appear to be ready to keep them for another couple of years. Now, a show of hands, who in this room has wondered why that isn't inflationary, or thinks it should be inflationary? Show of hands, who really? Okay. And the rest of you are what, vegans to raise your arms? My goodness. They really do need a beer or two to get going here. The reason why the Federal Reserve believes, this is a belief, this is not a fact, but in their belief system, they don't think that ultra low interest rates and excess money supply can trigger inflation, because when you have that big of a gap between what you could be producing and what you are producing, it will hold down inflation. They believe, this is the belief system they have, that when you have excess capacity, you can't raise prices because there's too much competition. That's what they believe. Now, whether they're right or wrong on that belief is one thing. But think about this in another way. What if they're wrong on their calculation for that potential GDP? What if we've impaired our ability to produce goods and services in this country, and that red line is shifted way down? And there's not much of a gap really between what we could be producing and what we are producing. Then the risk of inflation, even under the other belief system, is much higher. And if the risk of inflation is higher and they suddenly change their mind, they will raise interest rates faster than you can anticipate. Now, what's the other point from fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is taxes, by the way. That's a fancy way of saying taxes. The belief from the fiscal side is that if potential GDP remains higher than actual, we will eventually catch up to it. And in the process of catching up to it, we'll generate more business activity, more income, and more taxes, and help close the gap on the federal government's spending. Think about that again. If they're wrong on potential GDP, they're also wrong on the ability to generate additional taxes. So you sit and look at a chart like this, and you think to yourself, it's nothing but esoteric, who cares type numbers. And you think about it, it's not right. It gets right to the heart of both interest rates and tax rates. It's about belief systems that are based on hypothetical numbers. Now, hopefully, you should be getting a sinking feeling in your stomach about how much risk there really is in this economy. Because so much of this is based on policy decisions, based on these types of numbers. I'm not trying to scare people. What I'm trying to say is we just don't appreciate how capricious some of these numbers are and what drives the thinking of policymakers in Washington, D.C. For example, let's go back and look at the same thing. This thing is also this thing. I just went back further. Take a look at the recessions back in the 70s and the 80s. Those are what we call the classical recessions. A sharp decline followed by a sharp increase. But look what's happened in the last recession. You had the sharp decline, but you had no real recovery towards that potential GDP. It starts to really open up the question, is your potential GDP as high as you think it is? And think about what I just said. If they change the red line, they say it's no longer there, but much lower, then they change a lot of their assumptions about interest rates and taxes. So there's a lot of risk, a lot of uncertainty in the policy. Not so much in the weather as it is from what we're seeing from the government. Now, they want to grow. You want to see the economy grow. This chart tracks net investment in our economy. The combined investment of everybody in this country in terms of net growth. And this is back 1950. And the red line is the 10-year trailing average. You have a lot of variability year to year. Good years, bad years. But clearly, we've downshifted the level of investment in this country. And a good question is, why? We have ultra low interest rates. Another article of faith amongst economists is, as you lower interest rates, you increase investment because people are more willing to do that. Clearly, 4 years of ultra low interest rates have really not done anything to improve the investment stream in this economy. So there has to be much more at work than interest rates when it comes to investments. Now, the question that I ask is, what about tax and regulatory uncertainty? Once again, in my mind, those are bigger deals. But they don't want to acknowledge that in Washington, D.C. because they don't want to have to change that part. How about labor force? Think back to the slide about growing the economy. If you remember back, let's go back, it might be worth going back to there. Let's take a look here. The blue represents additional hours worked. Look at how little contribution we had in the last 10 years from additional hours worked and how little contribution they're expecting from the next 10 years. That relates to this slide, labor force participation rates. There's a lot of data up here. This goes back to 1948, just following the Second World War. We were between 58 and 60% of the population working, and then starting in the late 60s, it started to climb, rose up to 68%, peaked in the mid-1990s, and it started to decline since then. The reason that we see so few hours worked contributing to the overall GDP is because the labor force participation rate is declining. Once again, why? You can't give people concrete answers. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. But I have a portion that I know makes a big difference. Once again, it's called policy. Because when you give people more benefits for not working, you change the decisions that they make. It's a classic part of economics to talk about what we call is the reserve wage rate. The reserve wage rate is what people hold out before they go to work. They say, if I can earn, pick a number, $12 an hour from not working, I'm not going to go to work for $12 an hour. I need to get $14 or $15 an hour to make it better off for working. The reserve wage rate is not a criticism of people. It's not a criticism of whether they're hardworking or lazy. No. It's an observation of whether they have better off working or not working. One of the things we changed, policy-wise, is we're giving people more benefits for not working. You change the reserve wage rate. And once again, politicians do not want to acknowledge that policy has that type of implications. You think about all the connection points here, and there's really no way you're going to predict what's going to happen because so much of it depends on the political and policy side. Now, can you sell meat? Can you sell gasoline at these prices? Well, it depends on whether people have jobs and what they're earning. One of the biggest concerns we've had is we've had a huge contraction in jobs and a very modest recovery so far. Not only that, where? Because it's interesting, North Dakota has surely changed over the last 4 to 5 years. When I was driving through Minot in 2003, I was going to the Winter Wheat Show in Williston in 2004. You didn't have to look either way when you crossed the street in January. I mean, you couldn't get hit by a car if you tried. Who's been to Williston anytime recently? Anybody been to Williston? How about Minot? I mean, it's packed, right? But things change. But look at the difference in regional population growth. Because not only how fast you grow, but where do you grow? The West and the South, they've outstripped the Midwest and the Northeast by a 4-to-1 factor. Clearly, a very different dynamic depending on where you live, as well as employment growth. What about wages? Once again, everything's connected. Here we have 2 different measures. The black line is what we call weekly wages, nominal wages, what people can see on their paycheck. The red line takes it back and adjusts it for inflation. Clearly, people's wages keep going up, but their real purchasing power has been very, very flat for the last multiple years. And it has a big impact. Take a look at gasoline, for example. Here's a great example of pricing out of a market. The black line is overall inflation. The red line is gasoline pricing. Look at the volatility around gasoline pricing. We really shot up in 2005, peaked in 2007, 2008, crashed back down in 2009, and have since jumped back up. High-priced gasoline has killed gasoline demand. What's the connection to people in this room? Ethanol is connected to gasoline demand. We'll see this chart again later. But look where we peaked. We saw that first flattening out in the mid-2000s. We peaked in 2007, and we've seen gasoline demand decline on a running basis for the last 6-some years. That's a remarkable change. When we put together renewable fuel standards, RFS, for ethanol, nobody ever anticipated this big of a gap developing between the projection and what's actually happening. What's driving that? High-priced gasoline, stagnant wages. It's not that difficult to connect. Now, what's the forecast? Well, you happen to have high-priced gasoline and stagnant wages. Expect gasoline demand to continue to decline on an ongoing basis. Now, what's the Federal Reserve trying to do about it? They're trying to fix it through cheap money. At the end of the day, the Federal Reserve can't invent new technology. The Federal Reserve can't build new factories. All they can do